My name is Patrick Durst, and I will be moderating today's webinar. I'm an Evaluation Capacity Development Specialist at the UNFPA Independent Evaluation Office and one of the co-leads of Workstream 1 on good practices of evaluation use within the UNEG Use of Evaluation Working Group. As evaluation practitioners, we know that evaluations are only useful when they're used to inform decision-making, demonstrate accountability, and support organizational learning with the ultimate goal of improving results for the people we serve. Yet, despite the time and resources invested in producing quality evaluations, they're often underutilized. One of the most critical mechanisms for ensuring evaluation use within the UN system is the management response. Key guidance documents, such as the UNEG norms and standards for evaluation and the UNEG good practice guidelines for follow-up to evaluations, highlight the role of management responses in translating evaluations into action. However, challenges remain in ensuring that management responses are developed, effectively implemented, and monitored. Today, we are pleased to welcome a speaker from UNICEF who will share 10 practical tips from the organization's experience in strengthening the follow-up and implementation of management responses to evaluations. These tips are grounded in practical experience and offer valuable advice for enhancing evaluation use across different contexts. I encourage you to listen actively, reflect on how these tips may apply in your organizational context, and join the discussion during the Q&A session. Before we begin, let me share some information on the work of the Use of Evaluation Working Group. The working group was established as part of the UNEG efforts to enhance evaluation use and foster evidence-based advocacy, policymaking, and programming in the UN system, contributing to greater effectiveness across the 4 pillars of the UN. The working group consists of 3 work streams that focus on the group's different priorities. The first work stream seeks to identify and disseminate good practices to promote evaluation use through a series of webinars and a compendium of good practices. The second work stream aims to define indicators and methods to track evaluation use, while the third work stream is exploring the use of UN-commissioned evaluations by external stakeholders. Now, a few housekeeping details will be posted in the chat for your reference as I speak. Please take a moment to review them. With that, let's turn to today's presentation. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker today, Michele Tarsilla, who brings a wealth of experience in evaluation across the UN system, including in development and humanitarian contexts. Michele currently serves as the lead of the humanitarian evaluation team at the UNICEF Evaluation Office in New York. He is responsible for ensuring the quality, independence, and use of evaluations of humanitarian crises globally. Michele has 24 years of field experience with various multilateral organizations, including UNICEF, UN Women, UNESCO, FAO, IFAD, and the World Bank. Over the course of his career, he has been leading evaluations and delivering evaluation capacity development programs in more than 70 countries. Michele will present 10 key tips from a study on the follow-up and implementation of management responses at UNICEF. These tips respond to common challenges encountered in the development, implementation, and monitoring of management responses. They offer practical solutions to overcome these challenges with a focus on strengthening ownership, accountability, and strategic communication. Michele, over to you.
Thanks, Patrick, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I see that we have a very large turnout, so this is really good news for the group, which I've been a proud member of for about maybe 16 months or so. So let me share my presentation. Let's see. Could you please confirm that you're seeing it in a presentation mode?
Yes.
Do you see it in a full screen?
Yes, Michele.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so thanks again for the invitation. I think that this is an issue, the management response. How do you track the implementation? of the recommendations over time that kind of affects us all. So I have a very brief kind of agenda. I will provide an introduction. Why did we as UNICEF, especially in the region where I used to be working as a regional evaluation advisor 5 years ago in the Western Central Africa region, we started getting worried about the tracking of the management responses and the implementation of the recommendations. And then, I will go into what are the key challenges that we were facing. Then there will be the possible solution, an overview of possible solutions. So we can call them lessons learned. They're very much lessons learned based tips. And then some concluding remarks. And of course, this is very much the forte of this event is that we get to talk about, to share experiences, but also for a presenter like me to learn from your experience and possibly other different ways or complementary ways or alternative ways to deal with the issues that we'll be discussing. So I guess, in terms of introducing the subject, there's a review of the evaluation of management responses implementation that we did in the Western Central Africa region 5 years ago. It was in 2020. And the reason for launching this review, we can call it review or study, was that we had, first of all, realized that as we were the region with the most recommendations to implement across all the different regions in UNICEF, we had 2,000 recommended actions. Of course, we have a very large number of evaluations. But what was really interesting is that while, with my team, we were trying to make sense of all these recommended actions, a cursory analysis that we had done in June of 2020 revealed that 30%, so 30% of 2,000 recommended actions, so we're talking about almost 700 actions, had not been implemented yet, in the sense that had not even started. And the 43% of those 2,000 recommendations were still pending. So if we are seeing that, implementation of the recommendation as finally the moment where all the work that we've done finally gets closer to the field and possibly benefits those people, population groups that we're supposed to be serving, then I think we have a problem if a lot of those recommended actions after a year or after 2 years since the release of the publication of the evaluation report have not been implemented. And so we decided then, to start a rapid review that lasted, we call it rapid because, it lasted for about a month and a half, but there were a lot of consultations with, across the regions. I will tell you more about the details. And the idea was really to understand, first of all, what were the different country offices in the region, 24 country offices, doing in terms of tracking and implementing the evaluation recommendations. So in order for us to do a review and therefore also diagnostics of the issues, we needed to map out how are the different country offices doing and working this area of work. Then we tried to really understand and identify the challenges that were either internal or external to UNICEF. And finally, we tried to identify what opportunities were available to improve the follow-up of evaluations recommendations. Some of those opportunities and some of those, so to speak, strategies were identified based on the experience of some country offices that were already kind of responding to the difficulties and the challenges of tracking. Some others were emerged in the course of the sense making and the course of the different conversations that we had at a follow-up of the first research data collection. So what we did, we started some semi-structural interviews with evaluation staff, only in 7 of the 24 country offices in the region, just to understand a little bit what were the main issues. And we tried to identify those country offices where we saw that either there were a lot of recommended actions in general, historically speaking, or where the low implementation rate of those recommendations was, pretty obvious from our analysis of the portfolio. Then we did 2 webinars to kind of continue, with the consultation. And there was one in English and one in French, and we had about 20 country offices. That was July 1st of 2020. And it was during the follow-up meeting that the different country offices made further suggestions or, got into an in-depth or a more in-depth analysis of how to better collectively track and implement the evaluation recommendations. What was really interesting is that was 5 years ago. Now we are in 2025. And so I tried in the presentation today to build on the work that we have done 5 years ago, but I also added some more recent experience from the humanitarian evaluation portfolio in the UNICEF evaluation office in New York. What I was very happy about 5 years ago was that the end of the process, we just didn't produce a cute report that maybe just a few people doing evaluation in the region got to read, but we actually developed recommendations and guidelines that were taken up by the senior management in the different country offices. In UNICEF, when you work at a regional level, every 4 months, all the representatives from the country offices in the region meet together for a regional management team meeting. And the results and the findings and the conclusions of the review, including some recommended actions, were actually discussed and endorsed by all the 24 representatives in the entire region, which of course gave the review and gave the reflections coming out of this exercise that credibility that sometimes when we do this kind of publications and evaluations, you don't always benefit from. So I will start now that, we kind of provided a general introduction to the why we're here and, what is the presentation based on and what were the main challenges that were identified at the time. And I know that some of these challenges, of course, and I hope so, resonate with your experience. Well, in the first place, one of the greatest challenge that we had is that the evaluation recommendations are often generic and they're not very relevant to the intended recipients. And they're not always sufficiently discussed before the report comes out or before the draft report is shared with the intended audiences. In general, what we have in a draft report are very generic recommendations. And I've seen, a lot of consultants played it very safe, just saying, listen, we are evaluators, we are independent evaluators, we don't know necessarily very well what's happening in your organization. So by default, we stay generic, and then it will be up to you in the management response with your organization to respond to those recommendations and to actually come up with some, more granular actions. In my view, as a manager of an evaluation, that response in 2025, which by the way is still very frequent by many evaluators, will hide behind their "we don't want to be too prescriptive" argument, no longer holds. I think that the earlier we start talking or getting our hands dirty around evaluation recommendations in the evaluation process, provided that we have evidence supporting or backing up those recommendations, the better it will be. So in a way, we already started thinking, just looking at this issue, that maybe one of the possible solutions, and we're going to talk about it later, is maybe started talking about recommendations a little bit earlier in the process than what normally evaluation managers and definitely evaluation teams would normally do. Then the second, biggest challenge was limited ownership and also accountability with respect to the tracking of the evaluation recommendations. How many times in country offices, in regional offices, and in HQ, the evaluant, those who have been evaluated and those who have been a recipient or intended recipients of evaluations recommendations, they would tell you, I'm not responsible for this. You are the manager. You're responsible for this, your evaluation. So there's a sort of distorted understanding, if I may use this term, from many of our stakeholders that the tracking of the recommendations and the implementation recommendations is the sole responsibility of those who have manage the process and evaluation process. That is, people like us. I expect everybody at this workshop to be somehow an evaluation officer, a chief of evaluation, an evaluation specialist, etc., or an M&E specialist. It's also true, and the mea culpa, I think, applies also to me. I noticed that, about myself in some past evaluation processes, that we put so much energy and so much time into the evaluation process that once you get to the tracking of the recommendation and the implementation of the management response recommended actions, you have a certain sense of fatigue. You have this kind of hope or expectation that other people within the organizations and other colleagues will pick up the slack and will actually be the ones playing a more active or proactive role. And it's also true that in a larger organizations like UNICEF, where we produce a lot of evaluations. The moment we're concluding maybe 3 or 4 evaluations that we manage simultaneously, there are other 2 or 3 in the pipeline, which means developing new terms of reference, starting new consultations. So in terms of absorption capacity at the managerial level, it becomes very difficult to actually demonstrate the same level of proactivity that you may have had during the earlier phases of the evaluation. Then, what we noticed is that there's an opportunity, I would say a rather missed opportunity during frequent formalized meetings, let's say staff meetings or monthly coordination meetings, where those evaluations are not actually discussed. Those recommended actions are not being discussed. And I think this is a missed opportunity, because if we want to make sure that the evaluation culture is integrated into the day-to-day work of our respective organizations, it will make sense that during those important ritualistic moments where all the staff meets together, that the status of those recommended actions is actually part of the agenda. Another, problem and challenge that we find is that the evaluation stakeholders themselves, they're not always officially informed about the role that they themselves should play during an evaluation, including in terms of tracking and implementing the final recommendations. And in an evaluation where you may have, let's say, 10 or 15 intended recipients, because you probably work in a very large organization, you're looking, let's say in my case, at humanitarian responses. So you're working, yes, with the people who do humanitarian work in the organization, but you're also working with the people that do WASH in humanitarian, education in humanitarian. So you have a sort of scattered group of people across different divisions and offices that may not always have individually and collectively an understanding of what the role should be when it comes at the end of the evaluation process to the tracking and implementation of the recommendations. Then, what's also very interesting is that the evaluation findings and the recommendations, they're not always very well known within the organization beyond the members of the reference group, of those who actually came to the presentation of the final report, of the received the evaluation report. So there's a lesser degree of a collective accountability towards those recommended actions if instead of 100% of the staff in your organization, only 0.2% of your staff in your organization is even familiar with the evaluation and with the recommended actions. Last but not least, I think we're almost towards at the end of the presentation, of the problem section of the presentation. There's not sufficient budget to produce the dissemination tools and also organize activity that will allow to disseminate the evaluation recommendation, then create a sense of collective responsibility and accountability towards their implementation. So we presented the problems. So what about the possible solutions? And these are 10 tips. I'm sure that some of them you've already implementing them. Maybe some of them may be new to you, in which case I hope that, to hear back from you on the feasibility of implementing them, or maybe you have some rather, different experience with respect to some of these possible solutions. So the first one is to make sure that those meetings and those conversations around the feasibility, utility, and operationalization of the recommendations, that those discussions are actually held. And I think, and in our experience, it's much better to have those conversations prior to the validation workshop or the final report. Maybe there are different schools of thoughts here. There are some schools of thought. There are some that are saying, listen, get your report out, and then whatever it's contained in the list of recommendations, you discuss it with your team. In my case, maybe because, sometimes we don't have the luxury of waiting for the whole process to be completed. The earlier we have the opportunity to discuss the feasibility, the concreteness, and some people say about the smartness of the recommendations, just like indicators, recommended actions and recommendations should be smart, should be very specific, should be very measurable in terms of, can we monitor it, they're monitorable, etc. And they should be very relevant. relevant and time bound, which is another typical attribute of our recommendations. Then, again, what is the timing of such recommendations? In our case, as I've already told you, the earlier in the process, so even before the submission of the draft evaluation report, you can have some sense making or touch base meetings or strategic moment or reflections. You can use whatever label you think it's best, it's the most appropriate for your organization. So in this case, what you do, you take those recommendations and you take some of the findings and the conclusions that may be the most controversial, that maybe the evaluation team is a little bit unsure of, and you create a sort of different dynamic with the stakeholders. It's no longer the posture of we are the evaluators, we know it all, tell us what you think, but it's more we are the evaluator and I'm the manager managing these evaluators, and we are trying to get to a draft report that makes sense, that is useful, and it's a useful read for the whole organizations. Can we have a conversation about how and where this draft report is going, so that we could have some kind of validity or reality check during the process of and before the submission of the draft report. But you could also, and I'm going to share now two different examples, organize some offline communications about the recommendations. So you don't necessarily need to create, a live meeting where the different parties, the evaluant, the different stakeholders and the evaluators meet together. So I'm going to present now two very quick case studies. The first one comes from the Ukraine response evaluations. So what we did, we put all the evaluation recommendations of the draft report on a PowerPoint presentation. And we organized 3 sessions with the country office, with the regional office, and with the evaluation reference group. And this happened at the time after the first review of the draft report. So what we had the possibility to do during those 3 sessions, besides getting the perspectives of different people across the house with respect to those very same recommendations, we were able to get some more, thoughts, comments, and a sort of collective effort to retailor or refine the recommendation themselves. The PowerPoint presentation remained available online for almost 3 weeks. And the rule, there was a very clear guideline. You're not allowed to actually make direct changes into the formulation of the recommendation, but you could make as many comments as you like as a result or as a follow-up to the conversation itself. And of course, all these interactions, the possibility that we had a live meeting and then the people could also work offline. This, of course, was a monumental evaluation. It was a very complex evaluation. In general, I wouldn't allow, so to speak, 3 weeks for commenting, but that happened at the same time at the Gaza declaration for the L3 happened. So the colleagues across the house were very, very busy. And so as the evaluation independence lied with the manager of the evaluation and not with the evaluation team per se, this is what our evaluation policy says, it was in our interest, in our evaluation office interest, to reach an agreement on as many recommendations as possible and to make the final call in agreement, of course, with the evaluation team. I wouldn't keep this a secretive from the rest of the evaluation team that was externally hired with respect to the final wording. Then we had a different case study. This is a case study of the L3 earthquake in Turkey and the Northwest Syria response. So this time, what we did not organize any specific online session, but we basically sent 9 different emails, one for each of the evaluation recommendations proposed by the evaluation team. And each email was addressed to the group of the respective recommendations intended recipients. Having the kind of one-on-one communication was quite interesting for us. It was the first time we tried it. And this new way of engaging actually triggered much reaction. When you have the evaluation office sending you an email just saying, listen, this is the recommendation from the evaluation. What do you think? What is your response? Is it feasible? Is it smart? Is it already being implemented? Respond to this. It created a sense of urgency, this modality of communicating that was unprecedented in UNICEF. And so So despite the lack of an online session, we were able, of course, to get the comments and the perspectives of the different stakeholders on the recommendations. And for some, there were just a few bilateral team calls that needed to be organized with colleagues that were a little bit concerned by the recommendations and they wanted to get more clarity on it. Once again, no UNICEF colleague could make any change directly into the text of the recommendation that was cut and pasted into the body of the message. And comments were shared with the evaluation office by email. Let's talk about some other tips, and I'll try to go through them quite quickly. One thing that was actually very useful is that whenever you, as an evaluation manager, have conversations with some of the stakeholders, that you actually have some, or you formalize, maybe you have a conversation with some of the intended recipients of recommendations once the recommendations are coming out. So this is more about the tracking of recommendations, and you basically formalize the exchanges. So you write a follow-up email, and so in these emails, normally you share it with whoever you already had a meeting. You provide more details on the completion of the offline template of the management response plan. You already put in writing that there's going to be quarterly meetings before the evaluation staff or the evaluation manager and the different sections of divisions that are responsible for the implementation. And then you sharing the idea is that the minutes of these quarterly meetings will then be shared with the members of the management meeting or the higher or senior management meeting within the office, to make sure that all this work done at the technical level also will cascade up, so to speak, to those who are eventually the custodians of the evaluation function in a country office, in a regional office, the director or the representatives, so that it could be taken up for decision making. But, I think what's really important and what has already been tested in collaboration with the different supervisors and also the human resources is to include the responsibility for following up on the implementation of recommendations in the terms of reference of section staff, of office staff, division staff, in annual work plan, in midterm performance review, in the final performance appraisal of each staff member. If you have an accountability and a formalized accountability, and if you know that you're going to be judged or evaluated, or your performance is going to be evaluated against, among other things, even your ability to implement the recommendations or to follow up on them, staff will generally have a greater incentive to actually do monitor and track the implementation of recommendations. Then, of course, we should make a greater use in general. This has been a greater lesson learned for all of us of those fora that are available within, your organization to remind everyone, UNICEF staff, but also could be other partners outside, of the importance of both the tracking and implementation of evaluations recommendations. So the idea of integrating the discussions on the tracking of recommendations in country management meeting, in senior management meeting, and embedding this conversation, which could seem very dry and technical, but indeed also have a political and decision-making value, more or less symbolic, it's quite important. Also, what is really important is that whenever you have a management response being developed, you need to make sure that your colleagues at the division staff or the evaluant, they are kind of responding to the management response and coming up sometimes with concrete actions. You need to make sure, as the manager of the process, that there's correspondence between the recommendations and the recommended actions. How many times, for example, I had to kind of review a management response before it was, so to speak, formalized, set in stone and saved in a system, because somebody said, all right, so the recommended action under this recommendation is to have a meeting, and the proof that the recommendation has been implemented will be to present or upload in the system the minutes of the meeting, or terms of reference developed. So this kind of, output-based recommended actions, I think they're very, they almost dilute the meaning, and they empty out of any meaning the whole process of developing a meaningful and sensible and relevant management response. Of course, you also need to make sure, especially for the new staff, they're maybe just joined, or the more junior people that are not necessarily in touch with all the processes concerning the evaluation work, that this whole idea of the management response and the tracking and implementation, not just the development of the management response, but also what are the responsibilities and what are the accountabilities for tracking and implementing, that this is very clear to everyone. Last but not least, we think that creating and disseminating the evaluations, as I said earlier, and both among communities and partners, within outside of the organization, create again the sense of urgency and accountability that sometimes an online template by itself will never create. Otherwise said, the more buzz you make about an evaluation, the more buzz, more or less implicitly, you make about those recommendations and those recommended actions, including in the management response. So of course, you need to make sure that as part of the traditional functions and responsibility ascribed to your work, that you develop a plan for disseminating the findings and the recommendations, and that you could create intentionally the kind of level of attention and consideration for the recommendations themselves. Of course, when you do it among communities, and this is rarely done, you can work with the communications people. In an organization like ours, we have teams that work directly with communities. These are the people that we call communication and behavioral change, etc. They know the community dynamics, etc. So there's been cases in UNICEF, even in Western Central Africa 5 years ago, where we had some traveling cinema or short theatrical pieces, or we engaged children that were part of the National Children's Forum to actually disseminate the recommendations, creating then even a greater urgency within the organization, even at the higher level, because there's a lot of videos on YouTube or Facebook videos where you have these children talking about the recommendations, and therefore instilling once again, and probably more credibly than any evaluation officer could ever do, the kind of urgency around the implementation of the recommendations. The same thing would be to have the dissemination, not just with external audiences or communities, but also with the specific and sometimes quite numerous people and colleagues across the organization that are intended recipients of your recommendations. Last but not least, these are some concluding remarks. The tracking and implementation of the evaluations recommendation is indeed a shared responsibility. It's not just us, the evaluation managers or the evaluation people in the organization who should be taking care of this. Also, better tracking and implementation ought to be ensured from the get-go of an evaluation. It shouldn't be some kind of last-minute thought when we're almost, done with the process and we are maybe already projected onto the next evaluation. Last but not least, the face validity, therefore the acceptability at the stress test, so to speak, by the intended recipients of an evaluation recommendations in general, enables their tracking and implementation down the road. There's a greater sense of urgency and consideration of a recommendation if the intended recipients had a possibility to actually contribute to it and they see the relevance of it. You track what you think it's relevant for your organization many times, even if sometimes it's a bitter pill to swallow, but we've seen that the greater sense of engagement earlier in the evaluation process, the greater the sense of urgency and also accountability towards the implementation of those very same recommendations. So I know that, the moderator has some questions for you, but of course there's more like my personal interest. I would like to find out what are some additional problems that maybe, I didn't speak about in the presentation that you faced when tracking or implementing recommendations in your agency. And also, I think this is going to be the very interesting aspects. What are some complementary, or maybe why not, alternative solutions to some of the barriers discussed in my presentation? So thanks so much for your attention, and back to you, Patrick. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michele. This was a very insightful presentation, and thanks for sharing also the 2 case studies on the L3 responses that highlighted how stakeholders were engaged in formulating recommendations. So I think there's a few points that you highlighted with which have resonated with myself, as well as have been taken up in previous webinars already. One is the early discussion of recommendations, the early stakeholder engagement that is really key to ensure that they're actionable and realistic and feasible. And what I really liked also is the need to formalize the accountability for management response, follow-up, tracking, and implementation, as well as the point that you made about keeping evaluation and management responses on the agenda. So really including it in default meetings at all different levels of the organization, section meetings, annual and mid-year meetings, so that evaluation is really part of the discussion constantly. And finally, obviously, the effective dissemination of the evaluation results, that is key. And especially you highlighted as one of the challenges, the often low budgets that are actually allocated for this last bit in the evaluation phase. So thanks a lot for these very useful tips. And it will be interesting to hear some reactions from the participants. And with that, we'll now open the floor for questions. So please feel free to raise your hand virtually or type your questions into the chat. Michele has already provided some questions, so you might either pick up those questions or ask questions related to his presentation on the challenges or the tips that he presented. And we'll do our best to ensure that all the questions are addressed during this webinar. If not, I think Michele will be happy to address any further questions after the webinar, but I think we should have enough time to go through for a decent number of questions now. So over to the participants. If there's any initial reactions, comments, questions, please feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself. Okay, we have a question from Eloisa.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Michele, for the presentation. That was really, I was not going to say enlightening, but at least was reassuring that we are not alone feeling the pain. And my observation, and here is more about whether we as a community have observed of whether this is a problem that happens more often in organizations where they're very big, and then you have a lot of evaluation, and then you have a little bit of overwhelm with evaluation. I have been in those type of organization, and I saw exactly the issues that you saw. But at the moment, for example, I mean, I'm a small organization where we have a small function, so small evaluation function, and we're feeling the same pain. And here is for different reasons. It's more because there is a lack of recognition of the function that we should be, or the relevance of our recommendation. Thank you very much for recommendation. This is mine. I will take care. I will see what I do. Is the type of attitude. So we don't have the possibility to follow up because there is no real recognition of whether this is or not our function. So mine is simply that, is an observation of whether this is, where is the balance between being out of the game because we have too much, we are too busy performing evaluations, or not being using the evaluation because we have too much of a smaller function, and then this is not recognized.
Yes, so what was your name? The name of the colleague that just spoke?
Eloisa.
Eloisa, thanks so much. Yeah, I think the absorption capacity, not just for us as evaluation officers when we have so many requests for evaluations, but also for our intended recipients is a real issue. And that goes back to the first part of your question, which is when we work in very large organizations, the problem is, and it's kind of a contradiction in terms, the more successful we are and the more appetite exists for evaluations, the more we're going to bombard people across the organizations with evaluation reports and recommended actions. So one of the solutions, or one of the creative solutions that we are going to go for, especially at a time where and specifically dealing with humanitarian crisis. And unfortunately, as we all know, a lot of these crises happen in neighboring countries. So we're thinking of, instead of having separate evaluations of several responses, to actually assemble or combine different responses evaluation into the same report, because it's very likely there are some structural issues that repeat themselves beyond the specificity of crisis X or crisis Y. So having 2 or 3 reports that kind of seem to lead in the same directions when it comes to the recommendations will be a disservice, because we're talking about the same people and very likely about the same recommended actions. So this is one of the things that we are trying to creatively add on necessity, also to reduce costs, to try to do now. What's really interesting is that I was about to think, once you were talking, that now that you work in a smaller organization, you no longer have the problem, but that you proved me wrong immediately by saying, no, but you know what, we have the same problems now in the smaller organization. And I think maybe, going back to, the last 2 tips or lessons learned, they may sound unfeasible to some, especially now that we have no more budget, or they may sound a little bit naive. But, the assumption is the more noise you create about that evaluations and about the recommended actions, and the more, there's knowledge about those and who are the intended recipients, the more, this is something that could also be tested on, on a greater scale, the more those intended recipients will probably feel the pressure to deliver against them. The problem is, if the recommended action of an evaluation is to organize a meeting, and the minutes of the meeting is the proof that that has been done, that the implementation has already been underway, then, we could disseminate as much as we want, but people will still be in order with their conscience, and formally so as well. So we need to make sure that the quality of the recommended actions, first, is meaningful and is very high. And second, I think they created that sense of accountability by reflection of this greater knowledge and dissemination of the information around them. This is definitely something that could help. We could discuss it bilaterally also, Luisa, because I would like to learn more about the dynamics and the specifics. But this is maybe something, humbly, that from my opinion, that could be experimented. But I'm sure other colleagues may have different or maybe complementary ideas on this. So definitely, thanks for your contribution.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michele. We've also received some questions through the chat already, so I'll switch to the chat, and I see that other people have raised their hands in the meantime. But there is just a general question on what types of tools are actually used for recommendations tracking. So, Michele, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the EASY system at UNICEF that you use. Or just in general, what you have seen in your experience, what type of systems or platforms are used. And there's some concrete questions around, around the approaches that are being used to deliver recommendations. And maybe the colleague Angela Maria is within UNICEF. She's asking about, elaborate a bit on your experience on delivering recommendations through the cinema round and other approaches. And then similarly, there's a colleague who's asking about, the different meetings that were organized at different levels for developing the recommendations to as part of the evaluation of the Ukraine response. Yes. How do you avoid redundancies with the evaluation reference group's role? Are there any different stakeholders that were actually consulted? So I think that's an interesting question. And then related to the second case study, the question is, how do you make sure that there's still a collective approach to the determination of the recommendations if you send targeted emails just to a smaller group of people? So that you can also ensure that they're not overly influenced or biased towards the perspective of a smaller group of stakeholders. And I think these are already quite a lot of questions, so I'll just give you the floor to respond to those, Michele.
Thanks. So first of all, with respect to the platform, we also have the colleague Antonio, who was also on the call, who is the person, was our colleague that administers Easy. So, maybe, then in and of itself could become the object of another webinar. Easy is basically the portal, the evaluation portal, dashboard, or whatever you want to call it, at the repository of all our evaluative evidence. And when we upload evaluation reports in Easy, we also upload the management response, which means that not only is the report, but also the management response a public document, which means that each of you could actually go on our website and access for each evaluation, the report, the annexes, and also the management response. Speaking about creating the sense of wider information around the recommended action, this is a testament that we actually somehow walking the talk. If you have some more specific ways of tracking the recommendations, maybe Antonio, if you're online and if you would like to provide either in writing or orally, that would be, yeah. So Antonio, maybe you can jump in. Because I see a lot of people still doing it manually. So you reach out to your colleagues and you tell them. Of course, we got some notifications that there's a certain percentage of the recommendations that is underway, that has not even started, or that is being completed. But when it comes to the actual, as an evaluation manager, I must say, and maybe wrongly so, that I've not used Easy maybe that systematically as I should have. So maybe Antonio, if you could provide some more info, if there's any, smarter way or more effective way of using Easy for tracking recommendations.
Sure. If you can listen me, thank you,
Yes.
Michele. Just very quick. This platform evidence information system integration Easy is mainly used by UNICEF in order to plan, manage, and monitor different activities that are related to evidence generation. And we have, from the evaluation office, specifically aimed to follow the evaluation activities. We have a module that is related to the management response. So in this module, as Michele was saying, we upload the management response, the approved management response. And we have a specific section that each user might be able to upload actions and recommendations coming from the evaluation report. And we use this specific module in order to track and monitor the compliance of the evaluation actions and recommendations. So we have this system that is very useful in the sense of tracking and monitoring the actions and recommendations, but at the same time, we are trying to analyze with Michele and other colleagues in the office how we can improve the module, as well as to start thinking about other dimensions of the evaluation, such as the use and influence of the evaluation reports. But that is another discussion. For the purpose of this meeting, we use this system in order to track and monitor, and we have some KPIs, as Michele was mentioning before, that are aimed to track the management response compliance at the decentralized level as well as in headquarters. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Antonio. Then, we have, I see that in the meantime, there's so many more questions, so I hope I will be able to address them all. There's a very good question from on the redundancy of the reference group. And that's actually, I gave a presentation actually on the case study, on the Ukraine case study, to our global evaluation meeting in Budapest, November of last year. And this was exactly one of the reflections that I had. There's a risk, if you don't do it properly, that the reference group will just put to the side. In this case, it's true that some of the members of the reference group were also included in those meetings. So this is true. But whenever I decided to go down the road, I consulted with the evaluation reference group first. So just for your understanding, I did not deviate from the process unilaterally with without getting, the reference group involved on the way to proceed, just for the sake of transparency and for the sake of respecting everybody's role and responsibilities. Angela had a question about, can you tell us more about the presentations of the recommendations to the audiences? So there were many experiences, not just with evaluations, but also with some other work that we do in the West and Central African office. I wasn't directly involved myself in it. So these are just some of those experiences that were reported by our country offices. I know that Togo has been very active. So I could, talk to our current regional evaluation advisors in the region and also some other regional evaluation advisors to collect some examples and possibly share them not just with you, but also with the rest of the crowd. But we do this kind of work independently of the evaluation function, especially when it comes to adolescents and youth involvement. Then there's, I had another question on collective group. I don't know why I wrote this. There must have been another
Michele,
question.
that was about, the second case study, the Turkey response
Oh,
evaluation.
yeah, correct. Yeah. So maybe, out of I didn't, for the sake of privacy, because, I didn't have the time to kind of de-identify the different emails, because in my prior presentation on this case study, I had a screenshot of the actual email with the email addresses, etc. One thing that, was very clear is that the number of intended recipients for each one of the recommendations of the L3 Ukraine was actually a very wide one. So we had an average of 10 intended recipients. Maybe there was one among the 10 that has more the responsibility to actually implement the recommendations, but I did not see a particular risk in having 10 different people from 3 different levels of the organizations from different sectors being receiving on the receiving end of this email. And then, let's remember also that anytime that conversation happens, then those refined or tailored recommendations are included in a report that goes widely for circulation. And we know that behind those colleagues making comments, there's a much larger group of people that are maybe channeling their comments through one of their colleagues that has a responsibility for writing them up on their behalf, right? So in that sense, maybe because also the visibility of the crisis that was being evaluated, there was quite a large turnout and a large number of people that were actually being emailed those recommendations. So maybe it would have been a different case if we had just a very small number of intended recipients. Then, if I may, Patrick, there was an interesting question from, I think it was maybe Angela, I think. I'm not sure, but one of the question was, so how do you resonate with those recommendations that are included in an evaluation report, but they do not necessarily refer to the present, but they're mostly prospective recommendation for the next phase of the program? So in evaluation office, and more so in humanitarian, in UNICEF, we have made a very wide use of both the manual and AI generated synthesis. But in general, we don't just give the reports to AI and we accept passively, critically, whatever comes out of this analysis. This is why we always have the human component. We actually have real consultants that are paid, not just to administer AI, but to also do manual, analysis. So we had synthesis of recommendations organized by sectors, organized by level of the organization, organized by typology of conflicts. So in a way, those recommendations do not get wasted over time or do not get forgotten. And I think this idea of combining crisis evaluations to keep the costs down and to avoid to, create a much greater fatigue than in the past is one of those, as well as having this kind of multi-evaluation synthesis. You don't need necessarily 200 evaluation evaluation reports as was recently done. But even when we have a core number of evaluation reports, maybe 6 or 7 produced over the last year or so in humanitarian, then we have a synthesis, we have an event, and we actually have several events, and we're planning some of those events. So we'll make sure that, you know, the evaluation use working group members are aware of those, so that you could, based on your interest, also participate in them. I see there are many other questions, Patrick. I don't know if there's a specific 1 or 2 more that you know,
Yes,
could address.
so we can go 5 minutes over time.
Oh, okay.
I myself have to run to another meeting
Sure.
after this.
Okay.
But there's very interesting questions, and I would like to give the floor to the people who have had
Of
their
course,
hand up for a while already. We had Julia McCall, who I think also posted the question in the chat in the meantime.
Okay.
And then we also have Ade Bukole and Alena, one of the co-coordinators of the Evaluation Use Working Group. So maybe I will just ask first Julia to take the floor and ask her question, and then Ade Bukole as well as Alena.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the presentation. Really interesting. I was wondering if you have any insights on sort of the types of recommendations and their how that influences the take up of recommendations. So we see a lot of evaluations coming with either institutional recommendations or more strategic level or more at the programmatic level. And yeah, so what's your insights into that and how it influences the take?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Yeah, so in our experience, I could speak on behalf of the team here, a list for the humanitarian evaluation portfolio. We see that the operational recommendations are the ones that get a little bit more traction, and they're like the easier, so to speak, to implement. The strategic ones, you know, you really need to get the attention of the senior management. They normally A, require more time, B, require also deeper conversations with the government counterparts and with the external partners. If we really want to move to a strategic level, we cannot see a strategic level recommendation as a UNICEF strategic level recommendations. So I think the plurality of actors, intended recipients, that are sometimes more or less explicitly mentioned in the recommendations, because there's been a context where a government will never accept being, for example, mentioned as an intended recipient of those recommendations, because they would consider that this is not courtesy, this is not diplomatically viable. Nobody could, at the end of the day, we're guests in some countries, and we cannot tell them to do things. You must do this, you are recommended to. So it's really interesting how the human factor, you know, Antonio was talking about the mechanic way of, you know, tracking. And this is what the machine tells us. That many recommendations are being implemented, that many are underway, that many have not started. That's great. But the human and the diplomatic aspect of what we do, which I think makes our profession all the more interesting, is more critical. If you don't have access to the senior management, those strategic recommendations are going to be in the hands of some number 2 or number 3 or number 4 or number 5 of your respective organizations. And depending on the political climate and the things that are on their agenda, you know, some of these recommendations may actually not go a very long way. Yeah. So I hope I was able to address your question, Julia. Thanks for your question.
Thank
what's
you.
next, Patrick?
Thanks. We had Ade Bukole who had a question, and just in the interest of time, please be very focused in your question, and also Michele, if you could try to be as brief as possible in answering, so we can go for the other questions as well. Thank you.
Okay, I have one question. Okay, I have a couple of questions actually. I hope you don't mind. There are a couple. I'll just make them very brief. The first one is the easy accessible to the entire UN, meaning just not beside the UNICEF. Is it also just more for humanitarian or also for developmental? What do you do about timing for implementation, especially when the process of creating new proposals have already taken place, and then you know, evaluations take place at the end? So what do you do about timing for being able to implement that into new proposals? What do you do about money constraints, especially when this this implementation process takes place or needs to take place after budgets have been created. One last one will be there are many concerns concerning the going back to the drawing board. How do you manage that if that's part of the evaluation recommendations and the process for already creating, like I said, proposals have moved forward? What do you do concerning that process? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bukola. So if I have to charge people for questions, I will be very rich thanks to you because you asked like 5 questions. Okay, so I would probably defer to Antonio. Antonio, can you let us know if you're still around? Easy, now where are we with the opening up of Easy to other agencies or to the public? I don't know if you're still around with us.
Yeah. Yeah, I am here. Easy is only available for UNICEF staff, unfortunately. So that's the reason that I put one of the comments that we are working on an external module in order to have improved the tracking and monitoring of the management response by external key stakeholders. That's one of the wish list that we have.
Maybe,
yeah, exactly. But unfortunately, it's only available for UNICEF.
Okay, thanks. But our evaluation reports and our management responses are open to the public, regardless of Easy, because people could go on our website. Could you confirm that one?
That's true. We have an external website that it's pulling out all the evaluation reports and the management response as well. I will share the link in the chat, but that is possible. Yeah.
So it's substantively you have access to all that information despite not having access to a platform that will allow you to filter by country or region, etc. Then the other question was what is the duration of the implementability of the recommendations? In general, we track our recommendations for a period of 2 years. So the moment those 2 years are gone, and if please confirm, Antonio, if I say something that is not correct. The moment that the recommendation that the 2 years have gone by, then we don't track it anymore. So this is where the evaluation manager and their own unique sense of responsibility intervenes. When it to the timing is a very critical issue. I think you've seen in all my responses how I'm quite radical compared to some other colleagues who will wait until the final report, so towards the end of the final report of validation workshop, to have that conversation. I think especially when we ask ourselves, so what is evaluation going to help with? And if we know that there are some budgetary conversations happening or some strategic conversations happening, we need to make sure as much as possible, provided that there's evidence backing it up, because I don't want to, tell somebody, in the middle of my evaluation process, listen, there's an emerging recommendations, please take it and go with it. And then 2 months later, find out that during the draft report review, there was inaccurate information on which that recommendation is based. So you actually could play around with the timing if you have a very focused conversation. So I know that sometimes I would create 2 tiers of recommendations within the evaluation process. If I know that there are some urgent actions and there are some urgent decisions that need to be made, I will give priority to certain topics or portions of the evaluation in terms of data collection, analysis, and formulations of the recommendations. So this different sequencing within the same evaluation process of data collection, analysis, and formulation could actually go in that direction of helping someone to make a timely decision. Money constraints, we tried to also make sure that the cost of the recommended action is as limited as possible. One thing I learned while I was in a different UN agency was always whatever recommendations you have, make sure that doesn't cost additional money. Try to find also as a manager and with the evaluation team and with the colleagues a way to embed or to find entry points into existing mechanisms for that action to find its place and to get its visibility. There was a last question from you, Bukola. I think I forgot to write it down. I don't know if I answered them all. And then I see.
I think you missed one, which has to do with going back to the drawing board. If an evaluation requires that going back to the drawing board, what do you do?
Yeah.
Meaning going back to the beginning.
Yeah, can you give me an example?
Okay, because I've been in both lines, both the humanitarian and developmental, I would speak more to maybe the developmental, which has to do with maybe preparing a policy or creating a policy with the government, and then there is probably a coup in the country, and you have to go back to your drawing board because you cannot maybe access a few governmental agencies within the country anymore. What do you do?
Yeah, I don't know. The question is not very clear to me. Maybe we could have a separate conversation. I need a little bit more details because it's yeah. Is it okay? So we could talk right after this if you like. I will be very happy because I'm kind of intrigued because it happens to us all the time that we have to go back somehow. But I want to understand more what we're talking about. And then there's Elena, I think. Elena.
Yeah, thanks, Michele. We're already like 5 minutes over time, so I'm a little bit mindful also of everyone's time. Since Alena is part of the working group, I would recommend that we shift that question to a working group meeting so we can end on time here. I know that she's not happy, but I'm sorry. I'll have to manage the time also because I'll have to run to another meeting. So, Michele, if you kindly would be available for answering some of these questions bilaterally, because we have some good questions also related to lines of accountability when recommendations actually target implementing partners, and they need to make some changes. Okay, I see that Alena would like to make an announcement, so I'll give her the floor very briefly after that. But there's other issues that just have come up, Michele, related to the independence, to what extent is stakeholder engagement in the recommendation formulation, to what extent can you strike a balance with the independence?
Yeah.
What about the independent role of the evaluation office and its follow-up or tracking of recommendations? I know in different organizations this is handled differently. Yeah. As well as, I think there's a number of others. So I would just recommend for the participants to reach out to you bilaterally, if possible, and then you will hopefully be able to respond to them bilaterally. If that is okay with you, Michele?
Of course, yeah. And I will share the presentation after this, and maybe I will add some responses to the questions in the actual presentation. So so that we have a more full-fledged deliverable also for people's fruition. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. And now over to Alena for last announcement.
You're muted, Alena.
Right. So thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Michele. We have a wonderful presenter and a co-convener. I would like to make a quick announcement as a co-convener of the group. I see a lot of interest and questions also to technical parts of the tools for tracking recommendations. We are discussing with the co-convener and some of our group members to arrange one more additional event dedicated solely to the tools for tracking recommendations. And here, Michele, also you will be able, if you join, speak more about EASY, or if other colleagues have different systems, please also let us know. Whether they are very corporate and big or small, adjusted to small functions. We will be happy to incorporate this in the event as well. Otherwise, watch for more announcement. That's all.
Thank you, Alena. Thank you so much. And a big thank you to you, Michele, for the insightful presentation and for answering all these questions.
Of course.
And for everyone who participated today and contributed to the discussion on management response follow-up and implementation. This discussion will surely continue. You've also received a short poll in the chat, so hopefully you had some time to give us feedback on how we did on this webinar, which is helpful to improve our next webinar. And a link to the speaker sign-up form is also available in the chat, and we'll share it with all the participants after the webinar as well. So if you're interested in presenting at one of our webinars in the future, then please use this form to sign up. And with that, I would just like to end once again on a very thankful note to both the speaker and the participants, and I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Have a wonderful day, afternoon or evening, wherever you are. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Take care. Bye. Bye-bye.